Hi, I'm Johnny Lewis, and I want to thank you for coming to this presentation on People First Language. Here's the idea behind People First Language. People with disabilities make up the largest and most inclusive minority group in the world. And People First Language is an acknowledgement with our words of the humanity of people with disabilities. And it's acknowledging that rather than suggesting that they are less than or less valuable or less capable, that they have some differences that make the way that kind of the majority of people do things that don't always match those things, but it doesn't make them better or worse. It's just an acknowledgement of their humanity and acknowledging that they're differently abled to do a variety of things. So here's an example. Is it somehow more correct, or do you have to be smarter? Is there a prize for being the person who uses the steps to get into a building versus pushing yourself up a ramp with your arms in a wheelchair to get into the building? Does one of them make you more successful, more able, more gifted, or are they just two different ways of getting into the building? Of course not. And in fact, when I think about it, while I might be able to walk up the steps, the idea of pushing my whole body in a chair with my arms all the way up a ramp, I'm not sure that I'm capable of doing that. I'm not sure that I'm able to do that. And so the use of the ramp is not less than. It doesn't make somebody weaker or less capable or not as smart or any of those kind of stereotypes that people have of people with disabilities. It's just that the majority of people use the steps, and so they're going to access the building differently. Historically, the person in the wheelchair in our country has been referred to as a handicapped person. There are other words that people use that have even worse connotations or more negative connotations. This phrase actually comes from a game played in the Old English in which the loser of the game had to hold their hand in their cap. And so the connotation that comes from that historically is the idea that this is a person who is not as capable, who is not a winner, maybe a person who is a loser. Like, that's kind of the origin of that word. The truth is that someone who can use their arms to push their whole body up a ramp is very strong, very capable. They're doing something differently, but they're definitely not somebody who is who matches the origin of that word or the way that that word has been used to describe people who use wheelchairs in the past. And so People First Language is an attempt to put the person in front of the disability or diagnosis or the way that they're differently abled. It describes what the person has or how the person does things, and it does not use those things to describe who they are. So an example of that is the sentence, Katie is autistic. Katie is likely a lot of things. Katie likely has, maybe Katie has red hair, and maybe Katie has a 4.0 GPA in school. There might be a lot of things that Katie has, right? And so among those identifiers of Katie and all of the things that make up Katie is that Katie has autism. It's not all that she is, right? It's not the only way to describe her. So People First Language is an attempt to recognize that Katie is a human being first, and Katie is someone who has autism. These are some examples I've heard used in our building in the past. She is a special ed student. He is nonverbal. She is mentally ill. He is autistic. Anytime we use that is in that way, certainly not, I'm not suggesting ill intent on any of our parts, but when we use that phrase is, it implies to a student about themselves, and it implies to other people that this is the definition of their existence, that they are a student who's receiving special ed services. Like that's who they are. And so better examples would be to use people first languages, which might be to say, this student, she receives special services. This student, rather than saying this student is nonverbal, note that this student communicates with his iPad. Rather than saying she is mentally ill and suggesting that that defines all that she is, one of the characteristics of this student is that they have a mental health condition. She has a mental health condition. He has autism, right? So here's some tips for trying to change our language. We describe the diagnosis, not the person, has autism, has a mental health condition. We describe the ability, not the disability. And so instead of saying he is nonverbal, we say he communicates with an iPad, right? And we don't use language that suggests a lack of something, right? This goes back to that. Rather than saying nonverbal, which suggests this person doesn't have the ability to communicate verbally, we talk about what their strengths are and what they're able to do. I personally don't know how to communicate verbally with an iPad, right? Or how to communicate audibly with an iPad. But this student has that ability, so we focus on what their ability is. So here's some other phrases to avoid. Special needs. That just kind of implies a lack of what other students may have who don't receive special services. Suffers from, confined to or bound to a wheelchair. Dwarf. I'm not aware of any students in our building right now who are of small stature, or who are a person who is a person of shorter stature. But this is a phrase that has been used to describe people who are of shorter stature before, and it's considered inappropriate. Crippled, handicapped, all of those are phrases to avoid. Here are phrases to use. People with disabilities, or in our scenario, students with disabilities. Cognitive disability, person who is small, person who uses a wheelchair. Rather than handicapped parking, which is that phrase that has been used before that suggests this is a person who lacks something, it's accessible parking. It's parking that has been created to make the building accessible to everyone. Accessible doors, accessible bathrooms, accessible hotel rooms, all those things. They're rooms that are accessible to everyone. And this person has a mental health condition, right? So those are kind of the nuts and bolts of People First Language. Thank you so much for viewing this presentation, and these are the resources that I used. Thank you.